Thank you very much. So first of all, I want to thank Jason and Linda for an amazing talk. I think that it's a kick off our second day. Before joining Conscience, I spent 12 years in pharma, where the rule was, of course, don't talk about your target, don't disclose your structure, and get a patent. It is a valid model. It is used. It has brought a lot of medicine for a lot of diseases. So we're not saying that this is not something that works. But is it the best model? Definitely not always. Does it bring inequities? Definitely. So this next session will challenge the idea that open science must be confined to the early stage. I think that it all makes sense that open science at early discovery stage is useful. Can we push this further down the path of drug development? So the next two speakers will bring real-world evidence of some ongoing projects that are successful. First, I want to invite Max Morgan, CEO from Agora.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to Dylan as well for putting on an amazing conference so far. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak to you guys about some of the work that we're doing trying to move open science from the very early stages of discovery into drug discovery and development, I should say. So I guess just to sort of frame the discussion, as I think, and we've talked about this a little bit at the conference so far, but so why does this matter? And if you sort of think about the pharmaceutical industry, it's very good at focusing on certain things and innovating for certain types of indications. But when you look at things like rare diseases, there are in excess of 7,000 known rare diseases, each one with a small patient population, but in the aggregate is a very large burden of disease. And greater than 90%, perhaps 95% of those have no approved drug product. And so the individual small patient populations for these types of indications limit financial incentives for investment. And same when you turn to something like antimicrobial resistant pathogens. Some studies suggest that by 2050, if we don't get better at innovating new first-in-class medicines for antimicrobial resistant pathogens, there could be up to 10 million deaths annually. Despite that, there's limited investment in new antibiotic classes. And that's really related to some specific dynamics in that class of drugs. First, if you invent a new antibiotic, the incentive for prescribers is to limit its use as much as possible to prevent the evolution of resistant pathogens to that new drug. And of course, the treatment courses for antibiotics are often short. And then, of course, we have neglected tropical diseases, which DNDi and others have done some great work innovating in that space. But generally, large patient populations, but from countries that don't have health systems that can afford to purchase the medicine, and so you have a lack of incentives there. So really there are vast health needs that are not being met by the current business models and innovation policies in the pharma industry. So I apologize for this in advance, but I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit here. But you know, I think it'll help set the stage for what we're trying to do. So if you think about the pharmaceutical R&D process and policy environment, really you can think of it as spanning from a number of different phases, from basic science through drug discovery to drug development, which would include creating the preclinical and clinical evidence base for regulatory approval, and then of course commercial exploitation through marketing and distribution. Now, throughout the period before you get a product approved, there's a range of sort of information goods that need to be produced before a regulator will authorize its marketing and distribution. this starts really with the types of things that are typically done in academic settings through public funding, such as research to understand disease biology, to identify new targets that might be relevant, and even to do sort of initial hit finding and screening of those hits more and more as you see academic centers get involved in drug discovery. And then from there, once you've identified a promising lead candidate, there's sort of optimization work and further screening work that happens, and that's sort of the little orange square above the yellow bit there. So that I would sort of put together into this category of compound information. So we need to figure out ways to incentivize the production of information about compounds that can be used to treat disease. Pharma is particularly unique in that, in addition to that, we need to create a large evidence base, both in preclinical and clinical studies, to support the safety and efficacy of a newly discovered compound in order to market that compound as a drug. Now, the predominant way that our system of innovation tries to incentivize these activities is through intellectual property. And the primary function of intellectual property is really to prevent free riding on efforts to generate information about compounds and information about safety and efficacy. Excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water. The theory behind that is that if you don't protect those activities with intellectual property, that there will be an underinvestment in the production of that information by the private sector, because free riders could immediately use that information to compete with you. I think one thing to note about this particular set of information goods in the pharmaceutical industry is that the safety and efficacy information that's created after a compound is identified is by far the most expensive information good that needs to be produced in this process, because we have a system in which generic companies can free ride on that information to get competitor products approved without bearing the cost of clinical development. But that information is not patentable. So when we do a clinical trial or we do preclinical safety and efficacy testing, it's not something that you end up being able to patent. And so we use the composition of matter patent on the compound itself as sort of a proxy to create incentives for generating the safety and efficacy information. Sort of the holy grail in the pharmaceutical industry, if you will. But I think it's a fairly poor proxy for creating that incentive for a few reasons. I mean, it's under-inclusive in some respects, and it's also over-inclusive in some respects. So it's under-inclusive in the sense that the patent system treats anything that has been disclosed in the past in the whole of literature and academic science as not worthy of a patent. Because it thinks that if that information good has already been produced, then we don't need to incentivize its creation in the first place. But of course, in pharma, what we're really interested in knowing is a compound something that is safe and efficacious for use in treating a disease? And so you could very well end up with a situation where the composition of matter patent really doesn't provide an incentive to look into any compound that's been previously disclosed. So the sum total of compounds that have been in the public domain before really are ignored by this sort of composition of matter patent. And as an anecdote, I used to, my former life, I was a pharmaceutical patent litigator, and we would be sort of fighting over whether a patent was valid or not. And you know, our side or the other side would be digging up old literature from, you know, PhD dissertations in random libraries and trying to find things that would invalidate the patent. so that a generic company could come on the market. And I just remember thinking at the time, like, this makes very little sense. Because what really mattered was there an incentive for this company to generate the safety and efficacy information needed to bring a product to market. And so I think another thing to note here is also that there's a process in pharmaceutical R&D of not only identifying a lead compound, but finding a formulation and dosage form for it. There's often patents filed on this as well. Things like the polymorphic form, the salt form, the formulation, dosing schedule, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the idea there is to extend the life of exclusivity on the market for the product. And then once a product is approved, there's often efforts to find new formulations that improve bioavailability, new uses for products, things like that, and you can see patent filings there as well. I think a thing to point out about these patents is they're significantly weaker than the composition of matter patent. They're subject to frequent invalidation in litigation. And in many cases, generic companies can sort of design around them with different formulations and still get on the market. Another thing is this sort of life cycle management approach to patenting in pharma leads to longer disclosure delays. So the incentive in that system is to keep as little as you can, put as little as you can in the patent on composition of matter, as little as you can in the next patent, and keep as much of your data and progress secret so that you can maximize the opportunity for later filings. Because of course anything you disclose earlier is not eligible for patent protection. And you know, as another anecdote from my pharma litigation days, we would always be looking, the first place we would look for sort of prior art was in the prior patent filings of a company. If we were trying to invalidate a formulation patent or a dosing patent. Of course, there are complaints from some folks in the economic literature about you know, this approach being used to evergreen the exclusivity period on a drug product. You see things like a company switching to a new patented formulation and then switching patients and prescribers over to that, and then sort of ineffectuating the generic competition for the first product. Things like reverse payment settlements, so sometimes companies will come to an agreement not to challenge patents that sort of delay generic entry. These types of incentives are things that you would expect a private actor to take advantage of, but from a social good perspective, probably are not something we want to incentivize. But really the generic entry window kind of starts after the composition of matter patent expires, because these other types of patents are subject to challenge in litigation. Another point, and I'll talk more about this later, is that using patent incentives imposes barriers and costs on the research phase. That's sort of the underpinning of our model with Agora and M4K that I'm going to talk to you about. Now, with respect to the safety and efficacy information that's so costly to produce, the other thing I want to point out here is that the regulatory dossier that you sort of create when you do that work is also an IP asset. Not patentable, but it can still be owned and licensed. And once you register that package, if you have a new chemical entity that you're bringing forward to market, or if you're treating a rare disease, for example, in the United States or the European Union, you get a period of regulatory exclusivity where the FDA or Health Canada or EMA protects your drug from generic competition for a period of time. It's sort of, I think of it more as a more direct reward for generating safety and efficacy information than the composition of matter patent, because it's tailored to exactly what we're trying to incentivize, which is to find out whether a compound is safe and efficacious for use in patients. As I said, it also preempts free riding on the regulatory dossier. And unlike patents, which start at the time of filing, regulatory exclusivity starts as soon as you register a product for marketing and distribution. Now, if we turn to the economics overlaying this sort of timeline in pharma R&D, if you look here, I've sort of simply sketched out what an investor looking to invest in a new drug development program would see if they're considering their future costs and their future expected revenues. They're going to adjust those for risk and for you know, the time value of money. And what you sort of see in these large indication areas where pharma is sort of very good at innovating is that the expected future revenues exceed the expected future costs pretty early in development. So if you look here, there's sort of an inflection point where to the left of it, you see the sort of negative net present value. You would not expect industry to invest in that space because they can't expect a positive future return. And so what tends to happen is that public funding fills that space. So things like disease biology, research, target ID, tends to be a very academic pursuit that is funded publicly and through philanthropic funding as well. And from an economic perspective, though, the private sector really is not and should not be expected to invest in this. The risks are too high, the potential future rewards are too uncertain. However, at some point, as you move more towards a validated sort of in preclinical models target and into compound discovery, the sort of costs and future revenue inflect to the point where there's the possibility for a positive future return on investment that will attract investment. And I'm sure some of you here are familiar with the SGC's work. I sort of think of their chemical probes program and all the other work that it does for target enablement as trying to generate a positive net present value proposition for potential investors to invest in developing a drug for a new target. Now, if we sort of think about what it looks like in some rare disease indications that are underinvested, AMR, these sorts of areas of market failure, the costs and expected future revenues are likely to look a little bit more like this, where if there's going to be an inflection point to something where you would expect a positive net present value as an investor, it's likely going to be much later in development because the future expected net revenues are much lower, the costs are much closer. And so really I think of this sort of space between when we typically expect the private sector to invest in drug development and when they actually would invest in drug development as sort of a market failure gap. So really I think of market failure as a function of there being a negative net present value for an investor at the time we're expecting them to invest. And a thing I'd sort of point out about patents, which is sort of one of the reasons that we're looking at doing innovation without patents at this phase, is that having a patent or not at the investment decision point on the left is not going to influence an investor's decision because there's just not a positive return on investment there. Now, on the flip side, in large market indications, what you can see in that sort of scenario, economic scenario, is that the expected future rents on the market are large enough where many firms pile in with their own new chemical entities and sort of are progressing in parallel but in secret and keeping as much of their development progress as they can out of the public domain. And when secrecy and patenting sort of predominate in this space, you see duplication of effort, and if the target that the programs are going after ends up being invalidated in the clinic, you've now spent multiple times the amount you actually would have needed to in the aggregate to get to that result. That also entails opportunity costs because those resources presumably could be spent advancing other programs and other indications and targets. And of course, if we could have had information that a target wasn't going to work as to modulate a disease, we could have avoided enrolling clinical trial participants, etc. So really, from our perspective, we need to invent new solutions to these types of problems, new business models, and new policies that can sort of help to eliminate the market failure and help to prevent secrecy and duplication from predominating in drug development programs. Just one other point about the composition of matter patent, and one reason we sort of think it's potentially not as valuable in these types of programs is that if you sort of envision a scenario where you expect the clinical development timeline to take longer, you might end up with a scenario where you expect there to be no useful patent life by the time you actually reach market. And because of that, there's no actual expected sort of innovation incentive at all for an investor along the entire development pathway. This really relates to what's called the regulatory safe harbor. So anything prior to approval, if you have a patent on a compound or the structure of a compound, you really can't prevent anybody from doing any of the work needed to gain regulatory approval for that compound. It's sort of a freedom to operate zone. So it effectively doesn't prevent anything before regulatory approval. And if there's no patent life available by the time you reach market, then effectively you've got no incentive. And with regulatory exclusivity sort of layered on top of that, you could sort of say, well, in a scenario where the timeline is expected to be long or could be long, it sort of could rescue that type of program because it starts at the time of approval and would give some expected period of being able to recoup some of the investment. Okay, so we have these sort of market failures and these significant unmet needs as a result. There's a lot of untapped potential in the genome for new targets, but we're really not doing a good job of getting there. So why is that? Well, if we look back at our sort of economic model, when an investor looks at this point, the future cash flows from a successful project are highly contingent, and they're very far in the future. And they're also expected to be somewhat small in some of these areas of market failure. And so when you sort of take an investment lens to that and apply a discount, the future revenues look tiny. So the green on this chart, the green line, is the combination of discounting that you would do in any sort of investment scenario based on your cost of capital and the probability of failure at each phase, going along from preclinical into clinical, phase 1, 2, and 3. And in a scenario where you're looking at that investment from the preclinical vantage point, you can see the green line, the future revenue phase of the development program is way off in the future, and so the expected revenues are very small. It's very hard to model a positive return at this point. So that kind of explains the market failure in a lot of these scenarios. And so our goal really is to try to find a way to traverse that market failure gap and get from preclinical to something where we have a new target and a new compound, and that's used to sort of establish clinical validation for the target at usually phase 2A. And at that point, an investor looking at an investment at this phase has a much improved discount curve. The economics are much easier to sort of see a positive return. They have lower upfront costs to get to market, lower risk of failure, and shorter time frame to revenues. Now, of course, if you could push a project all the way to product registration without sort of taking private capital to get there, you can greatly improve the economics to the point where somebody you're asking to come and invest in marketing and distribution has no R&D costs, no risk of failure, and the prospect of immediate revenues. And so in an ideal world, we could achieve that for these types of market failure projects. You wouldn't need to see above competitive pricing on the market. You could hold an NDA but authorize generic supply. So we've sort of stated the problem a couple of times, but really we don't think we can look to private investment in the early stages of some of these large and unmet needs to generate a new drug, especially not if we're trying to get something to market that's affordable to healthcare systems. We do see some innovation in rare diseases where the incentive is there because of increasingly exorbitant pricing on the market to justify the early investments that are needed to get it there. We're trying to not follow that path. Our solution instead to sort of traverse this market failure gap is to try to imagine not only the basic science phases of drug discovery, but also the preclinical development and the clinical proof of concept as mission-oriented science and not proprietary. And to do this, we want to use an open science model that aggregates as many different inputs as possible to align them behind a charitable mission and to create an organizational structure that can coordinate a collaboration, can help to raise non-dilutive funding from multiple sources to move the program forward, and really with the point of de-risking a drug development program to the point where you've gone past the area of market failure and it can become interesting to a partner for investment, including at an affordable price. So in our initial programs, we've set up a virtual biotech company that's owned by a Canadian charity. The idea for this company is to hold the IND investigational new drug application to do clinical trials, to accumulate the regulatory dossier necessary for registration, and to leverage relationships with a range of academic and clinical resources, and to outsource critical functions where we need to contract research organizations and contract development and manufacturing organizations. We also want to ensure that we have freedom to operate by rapidly disclosing any potential things that would be considered inventions in these projects. Composition of matter patents on chemical structures, for example. We ensure that we put our progress out there as quickly as possible so that preempts others from filing in that space. And we want to try to engage in tech transfer to the private sector via investment or licensing after clinical proof of concept, and use the regulatory dossier as our primary asset instead of patenting. We feel like at that point we'll be at a much better negotiating position to sort of negotiate access and pricing concessions from a partner, or if we can sort of get ourselves all the way to a registration, we can induce competitive generic supply. In either case, we're trying to do this with non-dilutive capital so that when we license or bring in investors, we're not in a position where we need to pay back early, high-risk capital investors. And then, of course, along the way, we want to share our data from failed experiments to help others avoid costly duplication to the extent that others might want to follow suit. Of course, failed program information is a very valuable information good as well. And I should also say that if another company was sort of motivated by the work we're doing to themselves develop a compound for the same target and try to get to market, I think we would sort of see that as a win. We're working in areas where the primary problem is nobody's interested, and so we're trying to change that dynamic. Now, the eventual goal is to sort of prove that this can work so that you know, more governments, more philanthropies see it as a valid approach and invest in it, because really we need that sort of alternative source of capital to move these forward. As I said, we set up a corporate structure, a charity holding for-profit corporation. This enables us to sort of maintain project focus on the open science mission of this structure and affordable access for patients. We can hire employees. We can raise and disperse funding from various different types of funding sources. You know, in Canada, we have obviously scientific and charitable funders that would be suitable for the charity. But we also have industrial granting programs for which for-profit corporations are eligible. As I said before, we would have the corporation act as the regulatory sponsor, can enter contracts and license assets. And then the sort of goal here is when we negotiate a license with a partner, instead of seeking return on capital, we're trying to induce the partner to market the drug for as affordable a price as possible. But if there are any net returns that come back to the company, we would distribute those to the charity, and then the charity could use them for ensuring patients have access to the drug and investing in subsequent R&D programs in other sort of underserved areas. So what about patents? Why aren't we using them? So it sort of stems from an observation that you know, others around the table at the SGC, Al Edwards, and many others have made, that patenting at the research phases really makes it harder to sort of align limited resources from different institutions and allows sort of this decentralized approach to innovation to push programs forward. So without sort of worrying about patents at that phase, we think it's a lot easier to sort of crowdsource inputs, to collaborate with a lot of different collaborators, some of whom you don't know until you start your program and start sharing information, and to align them towards a mission-oriented project. And this is especially the case when there's not a large amount of central funding, because then you really need to sort of open up to other types of participants that may have their own sources of funding, their own motivations for participating. The other thing is that there's some literature on sort of ownership or proprietary approaches to research really driving out sort of other types of motivations for participating in projects. So when you sort of think of, you know, we're going to pursue a patent, it starts to become an issue of control, potential compensation for institutions that might get involved. Whereas in IP-free zones of production, you can see other types of motivations sort of for community production that start to predominate. Of course, open source software has been highly successful at leveraging these types of incentives. And then finally, academics are you know, quite motivated by this model. You know, they can freely publish their work during the research phases of development. Also, patents require a period of secrecy because you can't prior art your own filing. And so in order to sort of maintain that zone of secrecy, you have to have collaborators under an NDA, and there has to be an agreement about how you allocate IP over things that might be jointly developed. And so that introduces transaction costs. Now, that might be minimal in 2 or 3 party collaborations, but if you're trying to open it up to big, disaggregated, multi-institution collaborations, those sort of costs of negotiating and delaying the initiation of a new collaborator's work, and the governance complexity that comes about as a result of having these things in place can sort of erect a barrier. Okay. So this makes it harder to crowdsource inputs. And so, by not pursuing them, we can share our data as we go. The other thing is patents are extremely costly to obtain, especially if you're trying to file in multiple jurisdictions. It can divert time and resource away from research and development for folks that are involved in that. Monitoring and enforcing patents is extremely costly. Litigation costs for enforcing patents can be in the millions of dollars. So if we're sort of foregoing that particular form of incentive that sort of predominates in traditional pharma, what are we doing instead? So we're relying on this regulatory exclusivity asset that I was mentioning earlier in the talk. The idea is to generate a preclinical and clinical, at least to phase 1, early phase 2 regulatory dossier, and then that asset can be used to control subsequent development of a product for marketing, registration, marketing, and distribution. Like a composition of matter patent, they sort of preempt free riding on the innovator's work to generate safety and efficacy data. They're more consistent with open science in the sense that they're not predicated on prior secrecy. So if you sort of crowdsource contributions to developing a regulatory dossier, if you share your data prior to registration, it doesn't matter. The asset is a function of registering a drug product. They're costly. They're not costly at all. They're actually automatically granted by regulators, and they're enforced by the regulators. So you don't have to invest in costly litigation to enforce them. They're not really subject to gaming in the same way that patent lifecycle management is. There's a fixed period. Once it expires, it's over. Can't be challenged, so you don't have to worry about invalidation. The period of market protection is certain, so you don't have to worry about how long it's going to take to get to market. Once you get there, you have a certain period of regulatory protection. Now, when these types of exclusivities were first introduced in the US and the EU, they actually have been shown to lead to sustained increases in development efforts in the areas to which they relate, despite no change in the patent law. So they are a sort of powerful independent incentive. And they don't require a patent. So a sponsor can bring a drug product to market with no patent and still be eligible for regulatory exclusivity. I think the thing I would sort of say, I know we're running out of time, is just that at preclinical, we don't think that these areas of market failure are likely to be attractive for an investment. And to the extent that they are, they would usually be based on some sort of large market pricing. And so trying to attach conditionalities to a license to a commercial partner would be quite difficult given the negotiating position. Whereas if you sort of fast forward and can get your project to a proof of concept in the clinic, the negotiating position is, I think, significantly different. The switching costs for a counterparty in that type of transaction to go back and recreate the preclinical and clinical evidence base would be significant, so it gives you some leverage. And so sort of in light of the dynamic I was describing about the costs of patenting at the regulatory phase, at the research phase, and the value of this regulatory exclusivity asset for projects that have been sort of advanced into the clinic, the sort of calculus has been that the costs of patenting are not warranted in our programs, and so we're trying to keep them as open as possible and then leverage this alternative asset. I think I'll skip through here because there's some discussion to be had about the pre-approval dynamics. There are ways to sort of manage that, but I think what's sort of most important here is the program that we've sort of trialed this out with first, M4K Pharma. It's going after a rare pediatric brain tumor called diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. Thanks to all of the organizations shown here on the slide, including Conscience, who has now come on board to fund some of our I&D work. This just shows our staff and our steering committee, which is comprised of representatives from organizations that have made major contributions to the project. So DIPG is a dire therapeutic need. There's no approved drug treatment for it, uniformly fatal after diagnosis. We know quite a bit about the disease biology. There's a novel target. We have early enabling data and tools, but it's a very difficult investment case. And so someone looking to invest at the phase that we're at is faced with this sort of negative net present value problem I was talking about earlier. So if you sort of model out what would somebody that we wanted to do a deal with to market the drug at a reasonable price say, based on the economics, they'd say no way. And I've got that as $10,000, which is itself a high price. But the net present value of trying to do this in DIPG is extremely negative at this phase. And so what we want to do is try to get over here where we can take our lead compound forward, do the I&D work, do the initial clinical validation work on the target with the compound, generate the evidence-based, and if additional pivotal studies are required at this point, which we're actually not even clear that they are, because for an indication like this, it may be sufficient to do a phase 1/2. But assuming we did need to do an additional pivotal study, you could sort of quite easily model out how an investor might be enticed to invest with a constrained pricing commitment, because you're much closer to market. So I won't go into too much more detail about that. So we did our hit to lead program entirely in the open. We received $2.5 million in non-dilutive seed funding from the OICR and from the Brain Tumor Charity in the UK, established a product profile, a target product profile, and a screening cascade. And then basically we crowdsourced contributions to this program. We've had contributions from many different institutions with different resources, medicinal chemistry, assay methodologies, animal models, patient cell lines, et cetera, who have all sort of brought their own resources to the table to do some of this work. And the outcome of that was to synthesize, screen upwards of, I think, 800 compounds. We've got the Connect Consortium, which is a DIPG trial consortium that has come to the table and committed to fund phase 1/2 clinical trial of our compound if we can achieve IND registration. We have 3 late-stage candidates. Peter talked in great detail about our program yesterday, so I won't go over that again. And then we've got sort of our IND enabling timeline here. It's been mapped out by Peter, so we have a plan for achieving that IND registration to get into the clinic. We want to continue with our open science model. We still think there's a lot to be gained from doing things that way going forward as well. We can open source clinician and patient advocate input into trial protocols, analysis plans. We can sort of motivate partners by this sort of contribution, by making a contribution to the public good and open science, and enable external analysis of our data, so people can avoid duplicating efforts. Eventually, if there's more innovation in this space, there can be meta-analysis of data and full access to it for regulators, payers, prescribers, patients to make decisions. So we're a good chunk of the way there to funding our IND program. We still need to raise $2 million more. We've got a line on about half of that, so things are looking promising. And thanks again to Conscience, also to the Krembil Foundation for seeding this work. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we're open to the possibility of attracting investors through the PRV program. Priority Review Voucher Program in the United States is a very targeted incentive that's a little bit different than intellectual property. So it attempts to sort of address market failure as sort of like a prize type incentive. So there's lots of proposals for prizes in the economic literature. So you provide incentives for development without the exclusionary downsides to intellectual property. And so the idea would be you provide a prize to a sponsor who successfully registers a product, and in exchange for that, they forfeit the IP and allow generic supply of the registered medicine. And private investors end up underwriting some of the costs of failure because they have to invest to try to pursue the prize as opposed to the public funding clinical trials. But anyways, the priority review voucher program can sort of be seen in that light. It's an asset that the FDA will give to sponsors of new drugs that they can be used to accelerate the approval of another product. For example, a blockbuster that might be coming to market. They've been issued a number of times to date under this program. They usually sell recently for around $100 million. Right now the program is in sort of sunset mode and it hasn't renewed in Congress, but there's some hope that it'll be continued. And so the question is, can we raise capital for M4K, especially later in development, by offering a tranche of future PRV sale to the investor? I think the key thing I didn't say is that these vouchers are transferable, so you can sell them to other sponsors that can use them on their own products. And if we could use that sort of incentive, we could, instead of partnering with a commercial development partner, we could potentially bring it all the way to market by ourselves and then open it up to generic supply on the back of the PRV proceeds. I won't go over these slides. It's just to model out that you can model out a positive return on investment for investors in PRVs along the development pathway. And then I was going to go into some policy discussion. I don't think there's a lot of folks here that might be particularly interested in that, but if you are, please come talk to me. I'll skip that because I know we're running short on time. All the fancy animations and everything. Okay, thank you guys. Much appreciated.